welcome to DTCC's Financial Reform and Focus podcast series. My name is Dan Cohen, and I'm the Managing Director of Global Government Relations for DTCC. With us today is Andrew Douglas, Vice President for Public Affairs in our Europe office. Andrew's joining us from DTCC's office in Brussels, the home of the European Parliament and the European Commission. Andrew, thank you for being with us today. Let's begin with the status of financial reform legislation in Europe. While in the U.S. we are finalizing the rules mandated by the Dodd-Frank Act, the European Union is still developing its legislative proposal, known as the European Markets Infrastructure Regulation, or EMIR. EMIR comes in four basic parts. Andrew, can you tell us more about how EMIR is structured and the pace it's moving and comparing that reform to the U.S.?
The four basic components of EMIR are quite simple. Firstly, there is the clearing and reporting obligation, which applies only to derivative instruments. Secondly, there is the prudential regulation and conduct of business rules for CCPs operating both in the derivative space but also in the cash instrument space. Thirdly, there is the interoperability of CCPs, and this is specifically to do with cash instruments, so does not cover derivative instruments at all. And then the final piece is the conduct of business and prudential regulations associated with the operation of trade repositories.
Which parts of EMIR are proving to be most challenging for the legislative and regulatory process in Europe?
I guess there are three which immediately spring to mind. First is the scope. At the moment there's debate as to whether the scope of the regulation should be to OTC derivatives only or all derivatives. The second issue is that of the supervisory powers of the pan-European supervisor, ESMA, versus the local supervisors, so entities such as BaFin in Germany, the FSA in the UK. And the third one, and this is relatively new onto the agenda, and that's the extraterritoriality conditions that are contained within Dodd-Frank, that the European legislation is trying to work out, or the European legislators are trying to work out how they deal with those extraterritorial requirements.
And by that you mean the Dodd-Frank provisions that are extending U.S. law beyond its border, putting requirements on Europe in this particular case?
I do, and the issue that Europe is faced with at the moment, I think it would be fair to say that in Europe we have a tradition of mutual recognition of other jurisdictions, and so it's a relatively alien concept to European regulators to reach out into other jurisdictions. But I think the nature of what is in Dodd-Frank is making the European regulators somewhat nervous about the powers that the U.S. regulators have allocated to themselves under Dodd-Frank.
One of the things that we've been focusing on in our discussion with the regulators on both sides of the Atlantic is the harmonization of the regulations. When we look at these extraterritorial provisions, how is the concept of harmonization being approached by the Europeans, and what changes, if any, do you think should be made?
Interesting question. There have been some well-publicized exchanges of letters between the legislative bodies in both Europe and the US. We've seen visits by Secretary Geithner over to Europe. We've seen visits by Commissioner Barnier over to the US, and I think the impact of all of those has not really been to move the issue forwards. Where we are at the moment, which I think is a cause for some optimism, was the establishment of a transatlantic working group between the US regulators and the European regulators/legislators. I guess where you might consider that this potential solution is deficient is that it doesn't actually include any of the US legislators, only the regulators.
One of the interesting challenges is that the Congress decided in putting together the Dodd-Frank Act is that we wanted to get information out as quickly as we possibly could to resolve the issues in our regulatory markets. And the Europeans seem to be taking a different course of, as they say, getting it right rather than getting it out. But when it comes to these extraterritorial issues, there's one issue that I know you and I both share a concern on, is the provision known as indemnity, which in the data security area would require third-party regulators, in this case, as we're talking about, European regulators, to indemnify a U.S.-based swap data repository before it could receive information. There's a great deal of concern among some of us in the U.S. that this could lead to data fragmentation. How do the European legislators and the regulators view this particular provision, and what do you predict is going to be happening over the next several months as the legislative process in Europe moves forward?
I think the European view of this piece of legislation is very similar to the current US view, and that's not really understanding the purposes behind the legislation, not really understanding why a European regulator would effectively need to pay to have access to their own data from the trade repository by taking out indemnity insurance, some of whom are unable to take out such insurance on the basis that indemnification is not a concept that's recognized in all European jurisdictions. So I think there is a recognition that it's not helpful to the creation of global trade repositories, which I think by and large the regulators would say is a better solution than regional trade repositories. So what we are anxious to see, what I'm anxious to see here in Europe, is that actually Europe doesn't follow the US lead and put similar indemnification clauses into its legislation, which is always a danger, that at the moment we seem to have something of a tit-for-tat attitude between the US and the EU regulators, which is, if you put it in your regulation, I'll put it in my regulation. I think this is a dangerous road for us to go down, because essentially it's a game of chicken, who's going to blink first. I hope that here in Europe we see sense and realise that in actual fact to have the indemnity provision in European legislation, which it isn't today, but there are various parties who'd like to see it put in the European legislation. I hope that common sense will prevail, and the legislators and regulators will agree here in Europe that indemnification as a requirement should not be a part of the European legislation.
One final question. Different from the U.S., the European Commission presidency rotates every 6 months. We've just completed the Hungarian presidency with the Poles taking over. They'll hold the presidency until January, when Denmark then takes the initiative. Will the European Commission be able to finish the EMIR legislation during the Polish presidency, or will it occur under the Danish watch?
Taking your last question first, I would say that EMIR will be finalised under the Danish presidency. What is the timeline to get to that? The Poles have set themselves a deadline of October the 4th to have the Council position ratified at the meeting of the European finance ministers, so-called ECOFIN. That would then give them a negotiating position to then debate the final form of the regulation with the Parliament. Parliament already have their final form, or as near as it's going to be final, until it gets voted on in September. Then at that point we'll enter into a process called trilogue, which will be the Commission, the Council and the Parliament sitting together and negotiating the final view of the regulation based on their own negotiation positions. I would imagine that process, assuming that process can begin after the ECOFIN meeting at the beginning of October, so we're talking about the end of October to start, I would think realistically it's going to be quarter one before we get to a final position on that, which would put that fairly and squarely right in the middle of the Danish presidency.
To sum up, the Dodd-Frank legislation took effect in the United States in July of 2011. It appears, based on our conversation, that the EMIR legislation will probably bleed into the first quarter of 2013, putting a mere some 18 months beyond the Dodd-Frank legislation. Do you think that's accurate, and when do you think EMIR will get done?
The actual deadline is, at the moment, we're following the G20 deadline, which is to have regulation to do with derivatives in place by the 31st of December 2012. If we don't get agreement on the final form of EMIR until quarter one of 2012, then I personally would be very surprised if we were able to write all of the rules and have it all implemented by the end of 2012 as per the G20 deadline. And I believe it will be sometime in early 2013. So, yes, it's going to be 18 months behind the U.S. legislation.
Very well. We'll let that be the last word. Thank you, Andrew. We appreciate all of your time this morning.
Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about these issues, or if you have other questions about DTCC or financial reform, please feel free to contact me at 202-329-1825 or visit us online at www.dtcc.com. Until next time, thank you for joining us.